Hi everyone, and welcome back to Coachy TV. In this video, we're going to talk about how to plan out your 9-day microcycles for starting in your specific prep part of the season, but it's also what you really should be looking to do in pre-comp and the competitive part of the season. We'll talk about why you need to go to a 9-day microcycle. In fact, when I first was presented with this, I was like, well, what's wrong with 7 days? You know, we kind of live on a 7-day cycle and that kind of thing. But when we look at this, the idea being is, you know, we start to have more things to do when we get into the specific prep part of the season. But the things that we were doing in general prep are also still important. We started those early because of the timing of those taking longer, not because we could finish with them earlier. So it really does kind of make sense, and we'll kind of talk about why that is the case. And we'll talk about, again, why for the second half of your microcycle, these 9-day microcycles are better. And a macrocycle is your entire season. You've got your phases that split things up, and your microcycles are basically just before you start repeating workouts, and we'll go into that in a little more detail later on. And some of the things we're going to discuss are, why is using a 9-day microcycle the best thing for the athlete at this point of the year, not during general prep, but from specific prep onward? And what are some ways to plan this type of microcycle? Because it's obviously a little bit confusing. We're used to looking at a calendar that's got 7 days, and you know, if you're anything like me when you first got started, that's how you did your workouts, and you repeated the same type of things all the way throughout. And over the last little bit, I've kind of come through basically a 2-step process that helps me kind of, you know, keep this in mind. I've seen some other things that have also been used in the past that might help you out as you maybe try and transition to this idea of a 9-day microcycle. The picture you're seeing here are our boys and girls seniors from Wharton High School last year at our senior night, our senior day meet. 2019, it was our seniors. It was just after our county championships. In Hillsborough County, we have 27 high schools, and we all make up one conference. I know it's a little bit different in different parts of the world. Sometimes conferences are smaller parts of counties. Sometimes conferences are bigger than counties. But we have a really big county in Hillsborough County. It's the county where Tampa, Florida is a part of, and it's actually the 7th biggest school district in the country. So we have a lot of different high schools. So our conference is pretty much always just our county, the public schools in our county, not the private schools. Although the private schools sometimes do run in this meet, we kind of declare a county champion based on the public schools. So let's go ahead and get right to it. I'm Kyle Giacono, the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at some of my credentials, they are on the screen. So as I mentioned, you know, you've got these different ideas of cycles, right? And the macro cycle, that's the bigger of them, and that includes your entire season. So typically in high school, we have an outdoor cross-country season and an outdoor track season. At least that's what we have in Florida. I know some places in the Northeast and the Midwest also run an indoor track season. I really don't know how to get my mind around how to do an indoor season and also have an outdoor season, so I can only speak to what we do. But essentially, generally speaking, you know, I deal with 2 macrocycles in a year. And I think it works out nicely because of the idea that you've got 25-ish or 20 to 25 weeks to peak the aerobic system. So typically you can get 2 of them in a calendar year. A little bit, you know, you have to kind of make up a little for at some point because obviously you have to have a rest period. But that's the idea. So macrocycle always starts with a transitionary phase. It's rest and recovery in between. So typically you're having this rest and recovery period end of November, beginning of December for cross country. Into track, and for track into cross country, it's typically in that early mid-May, depending on what it is in your state. Sometimes it even goes into June. And then you get into general prep part of the season and prepping for more intense work. This is where we talk about, you know, your aerobic system being king, and it always is with the cross country 5K, but also some specific strength. But the idea being is there's a smaller number of workouts in the general preparation phase, and that's why typically you can do it based on 7 days. But then you start getting to the second half of the year. Basically, I'll draw a line right here because obviously the transitionary phase, there's no training at all in a systematic way. I mean, I would never tell the people who I coach to be totally bedridden, but I won't give them any workouts to do. And I would basically say try not to, you know, don't do anything like that. If you feel like running one day, go out and run. If you feel like playing soccer or ultimate frisbee or something like that, run around playing paintball or something like that. That's one thing, but nothing formalized training in the transitionary phase. But then there's that second line right here where the workouts really shift between general prep and specific prep. Specific prep, we've got this idea of specifically preparing for the demands of the race. And that's the idea of here we're just preparing for more intense work later on. In specific prep, you're really looking at all the demands of the race, specifically preparing for all the demands of the race, not just generally preparing for something more. And that's why it's different at that point and why we have more things to do. And we still have more things to do in the pre-competitive phase because we're preparing for the most important meets. And then in the competition phase, there's big-time races. There is the idea that in the competition phase, there's a couple of workouts that we were doing in general prep that are falling off. We're not doing intervals in the competition phase. We're doing more repetitions, but that's not what I mean. Things like fly 30s and that kind of thing that we'll get to later on in the training year. But really what I'm saying is here from specific prep onward, there's this idea of needing 9 days because we have more workouts to do. So this is kind of the way you want to think about it. Transition phase, no formalized training. General prep, 7 days works because of the number of workouts. From specific prep on is where we have to think about 9-day microcycles, and we'll see why here in a second.
So as we're looking at specific prep here, and we did this in general prep too, we need to look at the race metrics so we can specifically prepare for the demands of the race. And in the 5K, we'll find that the study that was first published with Ingham as the principal author in 2008, they looked at a bunch of different races to see, what was it separating the people who won and who didn't win the race. And in the 5K, it was very clear whoever had the best VO2 max, or in a different terms, who could run fastest aerobically, won 94.3% of the race. And that's as close as a sure thing as you can get in racing. Obviously, it's not 100%. There's other things going on, race strategy, other elements that we also have to train. But that's almost a sure thing in the 5K. And then we look at the USATF distance curriculum, we'll find that the 5K is run very close to VO2 max, or if we were to put a little v here in front of VO2 max, it would be the velocity at which your body reaches VO2 max, or maximum oxygen use. So that's probably why there's that such close association. One of the best tests for VO2 max, or the pace at which you reach VO2 max, is running 2 miles at your best pace. And obviously the 2 mile is shorter than the 5K, so it's going to be long. It's going to be run faster, but it's pretty close between this 3.1 mile race, 5 kilometers, and the 2 mile or 3,200 meters that is typically used to test VO2 max. So that's why there's probably that close association. But the other demands that we also have to look at, and that's really where our focus was, specifically for general prep, and also to kind of solidify that this study that was first produced or was released by Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, they worked very closely with the IAAF to produce this study. When they looked at the 5K, and they looked at a lot of different races, they even looked at 30 meters out to the marathon to figure out of the 3 ways that your body can recharge ATP, or in other terms, produce energy, where it was coming from at sort of a snapshot second by second in these different races. And what they found was that the ATP and then the phosphocreatine system, collectively called the alactic system, supplies 4% of the energy in the cross-country 5K. That's part of the specific strength that we train in general prep with your short hill intervals, eventually long, medium hill intervals, as well as your fly 30 type work. I'll put videos in the description down below for those. And then obviously, not surprisingly, the aerobic system is supplying 86% of the energy, which is not surprising again because of how closely associated VO2 max, which is an aerobic pace. There's anaerobic contributions, but it's still the fastest aerobic pace is to success in the 5K, 86%. And that's at race pace. If you were to go and walk a 5K, you'd have about 99% of the energy from the aerobic ATP recharging system, and there would be a little bit from the other two. But when we talk about the specific demands of the race that we start to do in specific prep, that's where this anaerobic glycolytic system starts to come into play in that 10%. And this is why we have to go to the longer cycle in specific prep and onward, because we're adding this element. We still have to focus on this. This is still the king, 86%. And we still don't want to just throw this away. And there's also this idea of specific strength that comes with training this system can help both the anaerobic glycolytic and the aerobic systems do what they do best. So these are the two that we were focusing in general prep, but now we're adding this, and this is really the reason why we have to change our outlook and how to actually plan out our microcycles. The law of training specificity, very important to always keep in mind, says that every training session has a specific effect on the athlete. And in this case, it's not even just the training session, it's the way you sequence them together. It's what you do in your microcycle or your workouts before you start repeating. If you decide to not do some of these glycolytic workouts and stay with a 7-day cycle and just do aerobic work, the idea being is you will not be getting that specific training to this energy recharging mechanism, which is 10% of the energy at race pace, and you're not going to have this. So the idea that every training session has a specific effect or overall training in terms of a microcycle or longer, which may or may not be desired for the event. So if you do workout A, there's going to be specific effect on the body. A is going to be produced, right? You do workout B, and training, specific effect B is going to happen in the athlete. So in general prep, if you want to think about it, basically you've got, say it's more like training 1 through 7, right? And you're going to get those effects in the body. But if you want to now also get this other bit here, you have to add them to the training. You can't just say, well, I want this to now be the case and have it happen without changing what you're doing. But you also don't want training this 10% to negatively impact especially the aerobic system, and you don't want to undo what you did with the alactic system. You want these all going at 100%. So the idea being is you need to specifically train all of them based on this law of training specificity, saying you have to train them correctly, but if you don't train them, they're also not going to get those improvements. So it's kind of that two ideas. Just because you're training an athlete doesn't mean you're making them better. Not only because of that specific, training, session you're putting through, maybe it's not helping them because maybe it's hurting the aerobic system, but if you're not training the anaerobic glycolytic system at all, you may also be hurting either yourself or the athlete that you're training, because you're not going to get that training effect that's needed, that specific effect that's needed for the event itself. So again, you have to always be considered, basically again, this idea of knowing your why. I've talked about this in previous videos. If you know why you're doing it, that you have to keep training the alactic system, you definitely have to keep training the aerobic system, but now we got to start training this glycolytic system, and we have to find the right ratios for all of this. If you know why you're doing it, it makes perfect sense. If you just say, I want to start training this, but you change nothing, well, then you're kind of missing the boat on your own why and what you're doing. So one of the things we want to consider is, how does adding this anaerobic glycolytic workouts help the athlete prepare for the specific demands of the race? And if the answer was that it didn't, if this energy system was nothing, then we wouldn't change anything. We would go all the way through. But this study and other studies suggest there is an anaerobic glycolytic component to the 5K. Every time you stop a 5K, it's going to be because of, if you've done it at race pace to your maximum benefit, it's going to be because of the buildup of acid based on the anaerobic glycolytic system, and we need it to be fit enough to push back that fatigue. It's really an important aspect of it, and I've got some videos in the description down below on intensive tempo, extensive tempo, special endurance 1, special endurance 2 that will start doing this. But that's the idea, and I would make sure I would watch those videos too. Otherwise, this idea of the need for this might kind of not be as apparent. So let's go ahead and continue. So where does the 5K fit in? This is that source that I was citing before, the USATF distance curriculum. VO2 max is right here, and the 5K is going to be just slower than VO2 max. So the idea being is, you can't just do the general aerobic work, which is basically to the right-hand side here. We've got VO2 max and aerobic power intervals that we've talked about. We've got our lactic threshold runs. We've got our aerobic threshold runs. We've got our alactic runs here for the alactic energy system. This is also pretty much where your short hill intervals are. But then in specific prep, we've got all these other things here in the middle that we also have to use to support the 5K. Extensive tempo, intensive tempo, special 1, and special 2. So just to kind of take you through, we'll kind of refresh why general prep is what it is and why 7 days is perfect, and then we'll see how it's actually put into place. So basically there are 4 aspects of general preparation training that you need for the cross-country season. We talked about VO2 max being really important, and then there are 2 parts of VO2 max. Central VO2 max improvement, which generally improves with aerobic work done for at least 20 continuous minutes, typically looked at as aerobic threshold or easy pace runs, but any continuous runs will also train this. And it generally improves as the body increases the ability to move oxygen from the heart outward. That's the central part of VO2 max. It's taking oxygen and moving it from the heart outward. This is sort of the bottleneck. Humans do not store oxygen for a couple of really good reasons. One, hopefully we're never in a situation where we don't have oxygen for more than about a minute or so. And if we did store oxygen, we probably wouldn't live for very long because it's very corrosive. So this is the big bottleneck that you pretty much have to start training first, central VO2 max development, to get the oxygen moving outward. But it's not the only story with VO2 max, and in fact I did a whole presentation on this. I'll put it in the description down below. But peripheral VO2 max is also very important, and it's done with aerobic power or VO2 max intervals. It's the only way to really train this effectively. The idea being it's work done at 98 to 101% of current VO2 max. Those are the intervals. I'll put a video in the description down below that talks about it. And it generally improves as the body increases the ability of the working muscles to extract oxygen from the blood for use in the mitochondria. So, two-pronged thing to improve VO2 max. We get the oxygen, more of it moving outward from the heart by making a bigger heart, more capillaries, these different things that move the oxygen. And then once it gets to the working muscles, we have to get the working muscles to extract as much of the oxygen off the blood as possible, otherwise it's not doing anything, and then it can eventually be used in the mitochondria. So it's 2 steps for VO2 max development. And then we also have this idea of running economy. It's something that a lot of coaches talk about. And any general aerobic work will improve running economy, okay? But it's best done at lactic threshold. It just tends to be a little bit better at using less energy for going from point A to point B. It's typically at about 85% current VO2 max, although that does vary with the athlete. A newer runner is going to have a lower place where this is going to be the place where lactic acid is going to accumulate. So it is based on the athlete, and actually athletes who are really well trained, it can even be moved up past 85%. So it does vary with the athlete and training. And it generally improves as the body uses the least amount of energy to move, point A to point B, kind of like economy in your car with gas. It includes several aspects such as fuel stores and muscle elasticity and all these different things. Running economy is really good at storing more of the substrate, or what your body uses for energy, close to the working muscles so that it doesn't have to take as much time moving it for your body to actually use it. And the last component of general prep cross-country training is that alactic energy system that we talked about. These ones are more about the aerobic side, the 86%. Running economy is also based a little bit on specific strength here, and so we've got things like hill runs, typically short intervals. It improves muscle elasticity and force production. Elasticity, kind of a double component here. And alactic runs typically as flies to improve muscle coordination and synchronization. And there's also elasticity. I should have put that in here also. The idea being is running economy is two-pronged. Lactic threshold is going to use less energy from getting to point A to point B. These two parts of which are kind of plyometric in nature get your body to be more springs back more, so every time you hit the ground it produces more energy and comes back from the energy that's coming down, and it's actually free energy. A couple studies have shown that you can get between 10 and 30% of the energy for free if you've trained this correctly. So it's the idea of why we want to do this. So these are the characteristics of both the aerobic system and the alactic system that we talked about before that make up 90% of the energy, and we start training them in general prep just because these two areas take longer to improve. The aerobic system takes anywhere from 20 to 25 weeks to prime because it's about building body structures to move the oxygen outward from your heart, to extract it all. It requires body structures changing. Your heart has to get bigger. You have to build more capillaries. You have to produce more mitochondria, produce more enzymes, different things that take a lot of time. And then in the specific strength, the alactic system, well, it actually never really even goes into peaking windows. The aerobic system, I mean, you probably will never get here in terms of a cross-country season, especially with a high schooler, but it'll actually peak after about 25 weeks, and then you can hold the peak for about 3, maybe 4, but then eventually even this energy system will go into a downward trend, and you have to go into a transitionary phase. The alactic system never really seems to go into that, so you can train this forever. So the idea being is that's why we do these in general prep, because they take longer time, about half a year for the aerobic side, and then this just basically throughout the entire life of the athlete. And these were the workouts that we said were critically important, and not important in general prep, and this is where we get our 7-day cycle from. The long run, the VO2 max run, along with testing and recovery runs, these workouts are vitally important to success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. Basically, this is your 2 different parts of VO2 max, both central with the long run and the recovery run, and the peripheral with the VO2 max runs along with testing. This also is going to be running economy being trained here because just running gets you to that point. And then these ones that are important, your hill runs or strength runs, all runs are strength runs, but your short hill intervals, your alactic runs, and your tempo runs or lactic threshold runs, these workouts are still very important to the cross-country 5K success, but a little bit less so than the critical, because these are 94.3%, the win predictor when we talked about VO2 max. The hill runs and the alactic runs, these are your elasticity, the alactic energy system, kind of collectively. And then the tempo run is additional additional running economy, targeted running economy, specifically using less energy, and it's also going to be your central VO2 max also. So there's some crossover between some of these things. The idea being is you take care of these first, you take care of these second in general prep. We've only got 6 different things really going on here, so we can certainly get these in 7 days, because these are not important in general prep. Special endurance 1 and 2, intensive tempo and extensive tempo. These workouts trigger improvements in the anaerobic glycolytic system, that 10%, by producing acid. This starts a 9 to 11 week peaking period and can reduce overall aerobic development if you do too much of it and too early or whatever. So we said that the more aerobic side of things, and tempo run is also part of that, half a year to train. These two here, the specific strength, basically a lifetime of an athlete. These take 9 to 11 weeks, half the amount of time, which is why in specific prep, we start adding these to the table later on to prepare for all the demands of the race. So if we started these too early, it would negatively impact us, and also we'd have to start adding these into this menu of workouts that we have to go to, and we would be going to longer than a 7-day cycle also. So that's the idea of general preps. You can see there are 6 different workout types here, so we can easily get these in a 7-day microcycle or your typical week. And just to solidify this idea of the multi-tiered training plan for general prep, we've got fewer things that we have to get done during general prep due to the fact that the aerobic system peaks differently than the anaerobic glycolytic system. As we said, the aerobic system takes about at least 20 weeks to peak out, and the glycolytic system takes 9 to 11, so about half the amount of time. These two systems in terms of the time frame that they need. Aerobic workouts needed in general prep. We've got these 48-hour recoveries because they're harder workouts. We've got the VO2 max run and the tempo run, and we've got 24-hour recoveries, long run and recovery runs. You can do anything the day after those. And we also have these specific strength workouts needed for general prep, and they're both 24-hour recoveries, your hill runs and your alactic runs. So the idea being is the relatively small number of workout types needed means a short microcycle is perfect, right? We have fewer things to get done before we start repeating workouts. That's the idea of a microcycle. If you do a VO2 max run, a long run, a recovery run, and then come back to a VO2 max run, well, that means you're on a 3-day microcycle, even though you haven't done these other ones. You've just decided that that microcycle is not going to include these other things before you start repeating. The only workout that you're going to repeat is a recovery run. This is going to space out some of these more 48 hours harder type workouts. And I actually use them also sometimes to space out these things and train different things. I would never want to go hill run, alactic run. They're just too similar, so you put something else like a long run or a recovery run in there. But you would never want to do 2 long runs in a microcycle also, because then you'll start under-training some of these other aspects. So that's the idea of what a microcycle is and why 7 days works perfectly, and it just happens to coincide with our normal week, right? So start repeating apart from those recovery runs. This, along with the fact that most of these workouts require only 24 hours of recovery, means microcycle planning is somewhat simple. You take out a calendar and you just start penciling them in, and you can kind of see it because it's just very easy. We've got calendars of 7 days and all that. So, and again, because we've only got the VO2 max run and the tempo run that we really have to watch in terms of where they go, and honestly, a tempo run, since it's one of the important workouts, if I have a week that doesn't have a tempo run, I don't lose my mind with it in general prep, because most weeks do. It's pretty easy to get this done. It's not really challenging for a coach in general prep to get this all in. You just print out a calendar or find a website that lets you type it in a calendar and that kind of thing, and boom, you've got your microcycles. You don't have to do some of these more complex things. 7 days is perfect length for microcycles in general prep. It's also sort of perfect for you in terms of planning. But things are obviously going to get a little more complicated as we get further into this. So here's an example of 2 general prep microcycles. I wouldn't do it like this where I actually sketch it out on a piece of paper, but I will do that for specific prep. But just for the sake of this, basically 2 general prep microcycles, and I've shown these 2 cycles in previous presentations. Here's one that from our hypothetical microcycle we've been going, or macrocycle, excuse me, we've been doing throughout the year. Say mid-June, say June 15th. You might have a recovery run of 30 to 35 minutes, 4 miles or so, a VO2 max test early on. You want to make sure you're getting these paces correct, so you've got 2 miles at, and these are just the colors that I do. Aerobic threshold or easy runs are green for me. Blue is VO2 max, yellow is tempo, and red is anything that's alactic. It's just the way that it works for my mind, but if you're wondering what those colors are. But 2 miles at aerobic power VO2 max with a 2-mile cool down. Another recovery run. Okay, so we've spread out. We've got this 48-hour recovery workout. We've got a recovery run, so we can come back with anything afterwards, right? Recovery run, 45 minutes, and now we've got the tempo run, the other 48-hour recovery. 4 miles or so at tempo pace with a 2-mile cool down. Well, we better come back with something that's a 24-hour recovery, and we did. Recovery run, 35 to 40 minutes, 5 miles. We've got a long run, 60 to 65 minutes, 8 miles. Short hill intervals, times 6, ends up being about 3/4 of a mile with a 2-mile cool down. We got all the critical workouts in, right? We got a VO2 max run with the test. We got the long run in right here, and we got 1, 2, 3 recovery runs in here. Perfect, we got the critical ones. Now let's think about the important ones. We got ourselves a tempo run. We got ourselves a short interval run. We didn't have an alactic run in here, but that's okay because this works the same kind of thing. Could you have gotten an alactic run in here? You certainly could. It could have been penciled in here. This being so early in the year, I think this kind of works out really nicely. Total miles of 40. Another one from mid-July, basically a month after when this one would be, based on our fictitious macrocycle. A recovery run of now 45 minutes, 6 miles. They're more fit. VO2 max interval, so we've got our VO2 max run, times 5 1200s, 3.75 miles, or 6,000 meters, with a 3-mile cool down. Okay, so we've kind of added to what we had here again because we're more fit. We've added to the recovery run. We've added to the VO2 max aspect and the cool down after. We've got a recovery run of 6 miles, so we've got our 48-hour recovery backed up with our 24-hour recovery. We've got our critical workout here of the long run, 12 miles, 90 minutes. Now we've got our alactic run in here, about half a mile if you do times 5 of the fly 30s. And when I'm doing mileage for alactic, I count the fly-in, which is 10 meters, and the deceleration of 20. So it ends up being not exactly half a mile. It's 600 meters, but it's pretty close. It's the easiest, closest thing that I can get to for the sake of this, with a 4-mile cool down. Another recovery run, and we've got our tempo run. We don't know what's after this, but probably something recovery run, maybe it's an off day or something like that. Our tempo run is now at 5 miles, but there's still a 2-mile cool down, so an extra mile in there, 55 miles. So the idea being in general prep, we pretty much just, after we get this general formula down of getting the critical workouts in, which are right here, and this could be anywhere, it just happened to be that it was on, I want to say this is probably Tuesday of these weeks if we went back and looked at it. And we've got the tempo run, it kind of moved around, that's perfectly fine too. Probably trying to move these workouts a little bit further apart just because this is now harder than a 2-mile test. The tempo run is longer. That might have been the idea here. Could we have gotten a hill run in here? Probably. I think if I remember correctly, if you remember hills, we do those in blocks of 4 to 5 weeks, then you go away from 2 weeks. I want to say this was a block where we were not doing hills anyway, so we got everything in. We got the critical workout, the VO2 max aerobic power workout. We got the long run in right here, and we got 1, 2, 3 recovery runs in also to space some things out and get some good bulk miles in with central VO2 max development. We also got the important workouts in of the fly 30s and the alactic run and the tempo run in here. So again, this is very easy. You can do this again just by printing out a calendar and kind of going at it that way. This is just kind of for the sake of putting them side by side. And as I mentioned, this is probably what some of you do, is you just kind of print out a calendar. This is from a website I've been using recently. If I just typed in printable calendar and it popped up and allowed me to type them in, I still like printing it and writing it out, and I'll show you later on in this presentation what that looks like in handwritten form. I just kind of like handwriting it also. But see, it's just also very easy to do it this way if you wanted to. This was the specific microcycle we were just looking at from July in that example, the 45-minute run, and as I was correct, this was a no hills for 2 weeks. We have the intervals day, the VO2 max intervals with the recovery run, the long run. The long run this week ends up being 21.8% of the total volume, which is still in the safe range of 20 to 22% because it's a 55-mile total week. Alactic runs, recovery runs, and then that tempo run that we talked about. And then, as I suspected, it was an off day after here, so that counts as a 24-hour recovery too. We've got another test, so we've got another critical workout in here. We've got the long run, we've got 2 recovery runs on this week, and we've got an alactic workout in here. So again, it's very easy to do in general prep. You just get a calendar, and it's easy because you've got the 7 days, but things obviously get a lot more challenging when you start looking at specific prep in the 9 days. So let's take a look at that. Alright, so this is the slide that we showed before, but now we're looking with specific prep training here, and as we said, it's kind of easy to do this. You get your mind around it. You've got these 4 aspects that you're training, you know your why each day, but then, because of specific prep, we start to get a little crowded because this new aspect of training that we're dealing with in specific prep is acid buffering capacity, or working on the anaerobic glycolytic system, because that's basically all you're doing when you're working on the anaerobic glycolytic system is, can I buffer the acid? Can I neutralize the acid that causes the drop in pH that causes most of the fatigue in these races? And the anaerobic glycolytic work done faster than VO2 max is how you do that. Generally improves as the body stores agents that neutralize acid, keeping pH near 7.0 to reduce or delay fatigue. I talk about this in detail in the videos about extensive tempo, intensive tempo, special endurance 1, and intensive tempo and special endurance 2 in the description down below. I would definitely recommend looking at those because I don't want to go totally in depth in them, but that's generally all you're trying to do mostly with anaerobic glycolytic training. And as you can see, now things start to get a little bit crowded. We had this sort of symmetrical idea. We've got these different things going on. We've got our 2 aspects of critical workouts. We've got these 2 aspects of more important things, but not critical. And now we've got these new things that are kind of causing us to do a little more work to fit everything in. And so now we've got this here, workouts in specific prep, and we still have our critical workouts. These are still critical in specific prep: long run, VO2 max run, and recovery runs. These workouts are critically important to success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. They focus on improving VO2 max, both central and peripheral, which we said is the key indicator for who wins. But these are still important too. Alactic runs, hill runs or strength runs, I guess I flipped those for some reason, and tempo runs, lactic threshold runs. These workouts are still very important to cross-country 5K success, but less so than the critical ones. They focus mainly on running economy and specific strength, which is still important, and we talked about this idea that the specific strength never really caps out, so we still need to work on those. If we stop working on them entirely, we'll lose what we gained in general prep, but now we've got these ones that were not important that are now quite important, and that's your special endurance 1 and 2, intensive tempo and extensive tempo, and probably in reverse order. You start with extensive tempo, go to intensive tempo, and eventually get to special 1 and 2. These workouts cause improvements in the anaerobic glycolytic system. We already mentioned that, exposing the body to acid. They focus on creating adaptations to buffer this acid, reducing or delaying fatigue. We talked about this, and this is why things start to get a little bit crowded. So for specific prep, I'm going to do this a little bit in reverse order, and then I'll actually show you what it looks like when I sit down and I do it as a handwritten hard copy version of it, because, I mean, that's just the way I actually do it, and it might be easier for some of you to do it that way. Here's our fictitious macrocycle in August, which is the transition between general prep and now specific prep. I've got a note here that I have no hills for 2 weeks, another one of those down cycles. And here's our first cycle of general prep all the way laid out. So we've got extensive tempo. We said we've got recovery run, a critical workout. We've got extensive tempo, those quite important workouts. We've got our critical long run, which is going to be 20% of the weekly volume this week. We've got our important workouts of alactic. We've got our recovery run, our VO2 max intervals, our critical workout, and then we actually have our first meet, which I'm going to treat as a tempo run, which is something that I do too. I hear a lot of times I'll see people say, "Oh, I'm tempoing this race or something like that," and then I see somebody that ran a race time that was only 20 seconds off their PR, and I'm like, "You didn't tempo run that. You ran that close enough to where it's going to take you a while to get back for it. You didn't really work lactic threshold this day. You worked something totally different." So personally, something that I do, and I'll flush this out a little bit more so, I'll give them a VO2 max workout the day before so that I've taken their legs away, and then and then they have to tempo run this. And we talk about that idea of 48-hour recovery and 24. You can backdoor a tempo run with a 48-hour recovery. You just have to give them something easy the next day, and in this case they'll have an off day, so there's nothing easier than an off day. So that's something that you can do. So we're getting through this. We've got our 7-day cycle, we've got an off day, and now we've got our actual 9-day cycle, the first one of specific prep, and we've got our first intensive tempo special endurance 1 workout here. Okay. Now, obviously, I stopped filling in the workouts, but if I had kept filling it in, it starts to get difficult to see, did I repeat things too often, not enough? That idea of, am I giving everybody exactly what they want, especially as you get later into the phase-specific prep and then into pre-comp. And it gets a little confusing because it doesn't always end exactly the way you want it to, but it's sometimes challenging to, okay, I feel like maybe I got everything in place, But when we look at this last microcycle of specific prep in the slides, when we go back to the slides in a second, you'll see that something is actually a little bit out of place. I think it's actually two things that are a little bit out of place as we're looking at this, and it doesn't really become apparent when you're just looking at this because it looks fine. Okay, we've got a recovery run, we've got intensive tempo / special one again, alactic recovery run. We've got a meet here that we are going to run hard. Which kind of counts as VO2 max. It's almost. We've got a recovery run. We've got intensive tempo / special endurance 2 again. Good. We've got our glycolytic work. We've got a recovery run. We've got our VO2 max intervals. Good. We've got our critical workout. We've got another tempo run. And a meet that I'm not going to say is unimportant. This is the course of our district meet, but it's just kind of one of those ideas of sometimes you can't get everything in that you want in specific prep, and sometimes you have to sacrifice something to get everything in that you need, because obviously the state meet is not happening on September 17th. Hopefully here in Florida it's going to be on September 7th. We've got our long run and we've got our long hill intervals, our workout type I haven't talked about, well I've mentioned, but I haven't really fleshed out entirely. So this looks fine, but we'll see when we look at the actual slides, when you start writing it down more on a separate piece of paper, it's apparent that a couple things might be missing, and that's where I kind of am able to go back to the drawing board and start messing with some things to get everything on point. So here are two examples of specific prep microcycles. Basically, the way that I would do it is once you've got it sort of on your calendar written out, the whole specific prep phase as well as your other phases of the season as you go further on, I then would get out a piece of paper and I would write them down, and I would in some way color coordinate it or mark it so that you know you're getting everything in those 9 days. So basically you're going to get a piece of paper and you're just going to write run through 9. I can show you the way I do it, where I kind of put a date range above it and I say how many microcycles I'm going to have in specific prep and say this is 1 of 4, 2 of 4, and that kind of thing, and go from there. And this is the way that it would look, and I'll show you guys also just what this looks like away from the screen itself. But essentially this would be from our fictitious microcycle, the first microcycle of 9 days in specific prep, and it's color coordinated same way that we were doing it before. So green is aerobic threshold type things, yellow is lactic threshold, and blue is VO2 max aerobic power, and then fly 30s or hills would be in this dark red. Typically I do it in a different color, I do it in an orange, but I didn't have that here in this program. So anything that is more like special endurance 2, which video in the description down below, basically anything from 300 meters to 600 meters type of thing is going to be in this color here, this sort of maroon, dark red. And then anything that's more like special endurance 1, which would be 150 to 300 meters, I'm going to put in this very drab yellow so you can kind of see it too. So with this first one here, starts about midway through August. First day is still going to be a recovery run of 45 minutes. This is probably a Sunday or something like that. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have started with this. In fact, I know for a fact it is a Sunday, just remembering what we were looking at. And then we come back with extensive tempo, the first true anaerobic glycolytic workout of specific prep, and we did it toward the beginning here on day 2. So we talked about knowing your why, saying you're going to start working on glycolytic stuff here in specific prep. Well, let's go ahead and rip the Band-Aid off and do it here at the beginning. Starting easy with extensive tempo. Again, I'll have a video in the description down below with what intensity that is. And it'll be 5 to 6 of these 400s. It would be on grass. And it's going to end up being about 1.5 miles if you do all 6 of them with a 3-mile cool down. We started the clock on the anaerobic glycolytic training. As long as we stay at it, that's something that we can continue to develop. We come back with a long run. Again, a critical workout. We're still doing it here, 11 miles. We got our alactic work. We've got a half a mile, again, 600 meters really, but it's easiest to put. And then we've got 4 miles on the back end. We've got a recovery run of 45 minutes. Again, here's a critical workout. We've got another critical workout here, VO2 max intervals. We're up to times 4, 1,600 meters. And the reason why at this point you'd be, we were 1,200s before, now we're at 1,600s. We're trying to, again, specifically prepare for the demands of the race, and this is more for the top end boys. I probably wouldn't have any girls that would get into this range because I wouldn't want them to do it if their VO2 max is in the 6s or even high 5s, because that would almost be half of a VO2 max test. It's more for boys that are almost right at 5 minutes or maybe under 5:30 before I would start doing something like this for. Otherwise, it just becomes too much to do it. But if you're going 3.1 miles in a 5K, well, we have to be able to hold this intensity for a little bit longer. So that's the idea behind that in specific prep. 4 miles and then 3 miles on the back end. Now we've got a meet here, and we talked about this idea of, you know what you have to get in some of these meets earlier in the season. you're probably going to want to sacrifice them because they're just not all that important, but you may need to get into a certain number of meets. In Florida, we have to run 5 regular season meets in order to compete in the postseason. So this is that Central Hillsborough County meet that we do. It's a mandatory meet. We don't necessarily have a ton of teams that actually have full teams. We're probably in the one of the least competitive of the divisions of our conference. So I'm going to treat this as a tempo run, but I don't like the idea of going to a meet and calling it a tempo run and doing like a recovery run the day before. Again, I just find that usually you end up not running a tempo pace. You end up running closer to actually VO2 max or your actual race pace. You know, just running 15-20 seconds slower than your PR is not a tempo pace, right? So what I do is I do the VO2 max or something hard the day before. You could do special endurance or something like that too the day before, take their legs away, and now I'm doing a tempo run. But again, that idea of this is 48 hours and so is tempo run technically, but you can do it in this order as long as you give them something really easy the next day and they're going to have an off day afterwards. So you can do this especially later on in the season. Now that we're getting into specific prep, they're going to be more coordinated for it. I would not do it the other way around. I would not try and do a tempo run and then do a VO2 max interval type workout, because this is one of the hardest workouts that we have. And this one, it's hard, but it's like medium hard, so they can kind of get away with it doing it that way. So here's our tempo run, 3 miles, one of the important workouts, not critical, but we're getting it in as we can. We've got our off day to kind of reset after these 2 really hard days here. We'll come back with our first special endurance one. And again, this because extensive tempos at 400 meters, it's kind of sort of, I'm treating it sort of like special endurance 2 in terms of extent and that kind of thing. And this really isn't technically special endurance 1. If you watch the videos in the description down below on this, it's going to be more an intensive tempo pace because it's early in the season. Times 5 of these, as you saw, it's 35 seconds, and I'm going to do them spiked up here at the track. And then 3 miles. So total of 61 miles, but we don't have a week here. We've got 9 days, and let's just kind of look at the things that are important or critical and all that. So critical workouts, we've got our long run right here, so that's the 1. Our second critical workout, we got our VO2 max workout, good, and we don't have 2 of those in here, so we're not repeating, so we're still in the same microcycle, and we've got 1, 2 recovery runs, good. So we've got our critical workouts here. So now let's talk about the ones that are quite important. They're not really more important than the other ones, but we need to start training them in specific prep. So we said this is like special endurance 2. So we've got that quite important workout, and we've got special endurance 1, that quite important workout. And then for the important workouts, we've got our tempo run right here. We've got our alactic fly 30s. We don't have any hills here, but as we saw from the calendar, it's on a break period from that part of the training. So really the only thing we're missing, as I said, is a hill run, but we're on that 2-week off period. So typically earlier in specific prep, you can make, this isn't a perfect microcycle, but you get everything in that you need to. If it wasn't a 2 weeks off from hills, you could figure out a way to make it work in here too. Remember, this is a 24-hour recovery, so you could certainly you could do it somewhere in here. You could do it the day after the long run. You could put the alactic somewhere else. You can move things around and get this in if you needed to, but we're on the 2 weeks off. So it's easy early on, especially because you have these meets that you don't mind sacrificing, but it becomes challenging, especially as you get late into specific prep. As you have hills, you start to get more special endurance type things in here, and now you have meets that you do want to prime them for. Well, now you can't get your critical workout here of VO2 max the day before the meet because they're just not going to be ready. So let's look at what would be the last 9 days of this specific prep phase fictitious macrocycle. Now, of course, this isn't exactly the way you would do it because you would count your next microcycle the day after, but these are just the last 9 days, just so where sort of the bottleneck can end up happening. So this is the last, say, 9 days, not really technically the last microcycle, as I just said. So we're going to start off again, a 45-minute recovery run here. Okay, so we've got 6 miles. And then we've got a quite important meet, Northport Invitational. Down here, the kids really like that meet. It's a faster type course. It gives them good times to where the team can perform in a really important meet that we have here called FSU Invitational. It's also where our state meet is, and you're ranked based on your time. So I want to make sure they have a good showing here at Northport. So I gave them, this is our normal pre-race, 45 minutes, 6 miles. They do so many of these. This is like nothing to them at this point. And then here for Northport, I'm going to put this in blue. It's kind of VO2 max, although we know that the 5K is run at 97% of VO2 max, and that's close, but it's not quite, but it's the closest thing to say it's a VO2 max workout, and 3 miles. Now we've got another recovery run the day after. And so now after that 6 mile recovery run to reset them, we're going to go right into intensive tempo, special endurance 2. It's going to be closer to special endurance at this point because it's the very end of specific prep, so they're going to have more rest. Same thing here, 5 to 6 of them, about 1.5 miles. They're going to do 60 seconds as fast as they can go, but it is going to be much more intense, obviously, than this extensive tempo type of thing. A lot of them are going to get to 400 meters, even though it's going to be 60 seconds, or very close to it, I should say. And it is going to be on the grass, and they're going to have 3 miles on the back end. We've got another recovery run here. This is a pretty hard workout, so we want to give them that before we come back with our intervals. We're now at the end of specific prep, so their VO2 max has gotten a lot better. This is very, very intense, so I want to do these as 1200s. It's very close to the amount here of the miles, 6,000 meters versus 6,400 meters, but still very close to it. So we've got this critical workout in here with 3 miles. We've got another meet here that I'm just going to be forced to sacrifice, as I mentioned, because it's in the middle of the week. This weekend happens to be one of the Jewish high holy days, so we can't compete on that, so that's why this meet is on Thursday. We typically don't have Thursday meets. It is our district meet course, so I want my kids to see it, but I'm going to have them also tempo run it here. So up here with Northport, I had to get them ready for it, so I had to run a recovery run the day before as they were doing it, because I wanted this one to be important. It's a more important meet. This meet, it's important for them to see it, but I don't really necessarily care if they PR and go crazy on this one. I want them to be ready for the next big meet, which is FSU, which this one is sort of priming them for. So again, we've got another 3-mile tempo run, so we've got a tempo run here in the meet, and again, I've taken their legs away the day before, so they have to tempo run it. Come back with a long run, and sometimes you might say, like, oh wow, that's kind of a hard back-to-back, but remember, long run is a 24-hour recovery, and they've been doing these so often. This is probably the 15th or so of these that they've done all year, so this is not a big deal. This is a 24-hour recovery. Is this the easiest thing? Is this as easy as 6 miles? No, but it's still pretty easy, so they can do this even after these 2 hard days. And then we're going to come back with the hill workout, but it's a workout I haven't talked about, long hill intervals. This is probably the hardest workout they do all year, and it'll be the second time they do it because we're at ×4, and I'll do a video series on this. It's 5 minutes uphill, 4 to 5 minutes uphill, just like as if we've done with the short intervals, hill intervals, the medium hills. Well, now we're at long hill, and it's basically kind of close. And I have this in gray here as a different color because it's kind of a couple things. It's strength work, but it's also almost close to being VO2 max. It really isn't because you have to be right at it, but it's also kind of close to simulates in the same way that this can be close to VO2 max, even though it really isn't. So it's a strength day. It's a specific day for the specific strength day, and it's close to VO2 max here at the end of the microcycle. So let's go ahead and look at this. We've got our critical workouts, right? Even though this isn't actually technically a workout, so I'm not going to count this technically as VO2 max run. Here's our VO2 max run for the week right here. So we got that in, and we got our long run in right here, and we've got 1, 2 recovery runs, same as we had over here. So we've got those critical workouts in. So let's talk about the quite important ones, the ones that we said we need to start doing in specific prep. We've got special endurance 2, which we had over here, but we're missing special endurance 1 as you're looking at it. So again, these things are not always perfect, and I'll show you why that might actually work out in your mind, and I may actually end up changing this before I potentially have my kids go through it. And this is why you do it, because you can identify these things that you're missing. So special endurance 2 is here, but not special endurance 1. We've got our important workout, so we've got our tempo run, but again, we had to sacrifice a meet to do it, but we still have a meet here in the cycle. We've got, this still counts as a hill run, a specific strength kind of day, so we've got our long hill intervals in here, but it's not quite the same thing as this over here. So we are missing special endurance 1, and we're missing something super short and super fast. So the idea of missing an alactic run and a special endurance 1 run in here, because there's just so much going on, right? We've got 2 meets, one of them we turned them into a tempo run, but the other one we had to actually make sure we perform at, as I mentioned before. We don't have the fly 30s in here. We don't have a short, quicker kind of hill interval now because we're going to long hills. So this is the idea, and then the volume is 68 miles for this, so it's a little bit higher. There's no off day in this cycle, which is a lot of it as you're looking at it. So this is where you kind of can identify your weaknesses, and you go back and you look, it's like, can I live with this? Is this something that I can do? Am I specifically getting them ready for the demands, and is this the best compromise that I have to have? And what I'll say as I go through these, I'm almost never completely 100% happy with these as you go through, because you just have so much going on. So you have to ask yourself, can I sacrifice something in this cycle, special endurance 1 and the alactic run? And what I always end up doing is going back to the big calendar just to see, okay, if I were to look at this, where did those workouts that I'm missing? They better be very, very, very close to almost being in that cycle, like the first thing we do afterwards or the last thing we did before we started that cycle. And what were we missing? We were missing special, and this microcycle, the last 9 days, is here to here that we were just looking at, right? So what do we have the day before? We've got alactic, and the day before that we've got special endurance 1. If I were to go and see what I put down on paper, we would see that here on the 21st, we would also have a special endurance 1 workout. So while this is by far from a perfect microcycle, it's very close to having them in it. It's 1 day off. So sometimes you kind of have to live with that, again, just because of everything that you have going on, from these important meets, which is what I would call this one here, the Northport meet. We've got this other meet that we have to get them into. I need them to see the district meet course. Some of the kids have never run there before we get to our district meet. But we have all these other things to get in. So that's the idea. Like I said, I'm never always 100% happy with everything that I've done in specific prep, but that's what I end up doing is I make it on the calendar first, I go and write it on a piece of paper, I go back if I see something that I'm missing and I look back at the calendar, and then usually I go back and I'll alter what the actual plan is. And in fact, when I was looking at this, I altered 1 or 2 things when I went and I put it on this presentation. So now I'm going to show you guys exactly what how it looks like when I handwrite it, because I don't actually do it on, like I said, a screen like this normally, to kind of show you and just walk you through the actual product, and it might help you guys, and I can talk about a few other things that I've seen done in the past. All right, so this is the 9-day microcycles, first starting with specific prep, but you'll notice that I went through and I did these for pre-comp, and I also did them for the competitive phase of our season. This is from last year's cross-country season. This is the way I normally do it. It's just sort of easier for me. I like to handwrite some of this stuff out, and I also handwrite out my calendars. And this might actually help some of you guys to kind of see what I do. And so I've got my little key over here. Again, as I mentioned, I always make green aerobic threshold. I always make yellow lactic threshold. Hills are always in purple for me. Blue is VO2 max aerobic power. Anything that's anaerobic glycolytic, whether it be extensive tempo, special endurance 1 or special endurance 2, I always put in orange. And then alactic, I always put in this this pink color that I've got. So what I do, as I mentioned, is I go through and I map out the microcycles. So this is the first microcycle of specific prep. So it was at that point, August 11th to the 19th. I had to start mine a little bit earlier last year because I had a team that I knew that I was going to have to peak a little bit earlier. So I started my specific prep earlier because I knew they had to be perfect at their regional meet, and they certainly were, to get us back, because we lost 4 of our top 7 from the year before. So this year, my macrocycle is a little bit later, just because it's a little bit different team. But I go and I put the date range, first microcycle, I just put 1 through 9. I mark which ones are the Sundays, just because obviously you know no high school association is allowing you to train your kids on Sunday, but you can still have them do things on a Sunday if they so chose. I have a video on rest days and that kind of thing and how I treat this. I will put that in the description down below also. But this is what I do, is I go through and I mark it. I list the Sundays just to make sure I'm not trying to do something that you would have to be there with them on. And then as I put it through, I go through just kind of like you saw on the screen, the amount of time, the amount of total miles for some of them. If there's a cool down, that's like the plus here just for me. And then I mark it with what I'm training, and then I can go back and I can see, okay, I've got my long run, I've got my VO2 max run, I've got my recovery runs in here, also in green. I've got my glycolytic work, my extensive tempo here, and I've got my tempo run and my alactic stuff in here. No hills. I believe this was also a time period when I was not on a hill cycle. So I've got 67 miles here in the 9 days. Go to the second one and just start right where you left off, 19. So we got 20 to the 28, and same kind of thing here. As I look through, I can kind of see it with my eyes. Okay, I know I don't have a tempo run in here, because it just sticks out to me that I don't have it. And I also technically don't have special endurance 2. Technically, you could kind of think that special endurance 2 here is this extensive tempo because it's 400, so you can kind of say, okay, that's the day before. And if I were to look at this one, I'll see, okay, I don't have a tempo run to start the next one either. Now, if I'm going to sacrifice something, and I've said this before, tempo runs are important. Oh, wait, I do have a tempo run here. Okay, never mind, so I did have it, but as you can kind of see, as I'm looking at this, I must have changed my mind because I saw a recovery run here and now I've got a tempo run here. So the idea being is you can go through and you can change your mind. If I didn't have a tempo run here, I wouldn't have lost my mind, although I wouldn't have wanted to have it quite that long either. So I probably saw this and saw, oh, no tempo run. Let me go ahead and change this and make sure I get a tempo run in here of some kind. It must have been some kind of meet that I ended up doing that, which you definitely can do early on in the season. So, that's sort of the idea of color coordinated, so it jumps out to you as you're doing it. Again, this is kind of your Special Endurance 2, Special Endurance 1, and it's the day before this one started. This is a 70-mile 9-day microcycle versus the 67-mile microcycle. As you're also looking at this year I chose to start extensive tempo at the end of this cycle, whereas you saw with the one that I showed you on the screen that we did it first thing. So this is the idea that we needed to start it earlier, but I didn't want to start it crazy earlier. We look at the third microcycle, which is the August 29th to September 6th. We have this idea of here's the long hill starting this time. We've got our fly 30s, long run, rest day. We've got a VO2 max test, long run. And I have 2 long runs in here, and I'm not quite sure why I settled on that other than the fact that the long run, I guess being at the beginning of the cycle, I must have thought that I needed to have it in here for some reason. I can't remember exactly what the reasoning was. That I did this, other than the fact that maybe I just thought they needed it after this VO2 max test. They've got a tempo run in here, they've got Special Endurance 2, which they didn't have in the other ones, and again, they don't necessarily have Special Endurance 1 in here in this cycle, so the idea of none of this is necessarily perfect as you're doing it. 72 miles here on this cycle in here. And as I'm also looking here, we've got September 7th to the 15th, we had a race. It's our pre-regional meet, so that's a really important meet for us. Again, I need them to be peaking at that point. We've got our long run in here. We've got a secondary race in here. You'll notice there's no true VO2 max workout in here. We've got this test. We've got these 2 races that can kind of serve as VO2 max, and these long hills, which I kind of color coordinated as both, because like I said, it sort of serves as that. And I think, if you see, there's no Special Endurance anything in here, probably because of the nature of the fact that we had race, that close together. And I want to say, if I look in here, we had another race, 3 weekends in a row. So that really kind of screwed things up, and it's something that I am going to try to avoid this season, the idea of going back and building a better mousetrap every single year. And that takes us through specific prep. For that, we get into pre-comp, and then I start doing it again. I just start with a new one. This must have been on a Sunday because it's a rest day here. And they go through 3 cycles of pre-comp, and they end up having 1, 2, 3 cycles. I guess it was 3 cycles plus 2 days to the state meet here. So these are some different, and as you saw as we kind of got later in the year, there's a little bit more of these anaerobic glycolytic type of workouts kind of making their appearance. I must have decided, because I didn't have yep, exactly. So I didn't have anything here in this cycle that was anaerobic glycolytic. I must have decided I better make sure I get 2 really quick in here and then get another one as we got into pre-comp. So as I mentioned, none of it's perfect. As I'm just kind of glancing at this, I'm still finding things that I probably could have changed and made better. But again, that's the idea. You have to figure out what you can compromise on and what you can't compromise on with what part of the season you have, what kind of team you have, and all of those different things that you have to kind of factor in. So what I'm going to end up doing is what we have here on the screen with those cycles. I'm going to end up doing this too. I'm going to write it all out, and I'm probably going to pencil some things in, change some things like I ended up doing here from the original recovery run. I need to get a tempo run in there, and I'll probably end up doing that and come to something that I can be very comfortable with, that I'm giving them most of what they need. But obviously nothing is going to be perfect as you're going through it. So I've also seen this done with one very successful coach in the past, where they would have index cards that had all the workout types written on them. And they didn't necessarily have like the 45 minutes or alactic times 8. They didn't have VO2 max 1600s versus 1200 or whatever, or extensive tempo. It was really just alactic was on the card, long run was on the card, VO2 max interval was on the card. And basically what they did was they took them all and they just kind of put them in an order, and before they would do the next one, before they could start getting cards that had the same thing on it again, they had to use all of the originals that they had. If you're somebody that kind of has to see things move around as opposed to writing it down,
or doing it on a computer screen, that might be something else that could work for you. I've never actually worked that way, making it almost like a puzzle or something like that, but that's another way that you might be able to do it. Just write it on a card and have your set of, you know, however many workouts you've got, and say, all right, I'm not going back and repeating until I use all of these cards, and you can shift them around and figure it out. You're gonna want to have one that also has like meet days or something like that too, so that you can pencil those in as they see fit, as they come up in the actual meets too. But those are just some different things that you can actually use as you are figuring out what works best for you and coming up with your why for your season.
All right, some key points to take away from this presentation. Specific prep typically requires a 9-day microcycle for cross country. It would also be this way for track and the distance races, the 3,200 meter and the 1,600 meter. It would be different actually for a middle distance runner running the 800 and the 1,600 or even the 400. The reason for these 9-day microcycles being needed is due to needing to add in anaerobic glycolytic workouts to start priming this energy supply mechanism. And we still have to work the same VO2 max, economy, and specific strength aspects that were important in general prep. So nothing went away, we've had it to add, so these perfect 7-day cycles that we did in general prep cannot fit now that we've added these other workout types. This does become challenging, especially with meets. As you saw, that first fictitious microcycle that we were making was very easy to do. We had everything in besides hills, but we weren't trying to get hills in that week because it was a down period. That second one that had meets and things like that we were trying to get in, important meets that we couldn't sacrifice into tempo runs and all these other things that are going on, along with things, you know, your rest days and everything, it becomes challenging. I personally do a first plan looking at a calendar, as I showed you, have a calendar printed out and put the meets in, put the important workouts in, the critical workouts in, then the important ones, and then I go through with what I made on that calendar and I write out 9-day cycles on separate paper, which I showed you both on the screen, and then I showed you the example from last year. And actually what I do with those, that hard copy, I don't even know why I still had that hard copy lying around. I usually do scan that and keep it in my files just so I can go back and refer to it when I started things in years past. But as I go back and I do this on separate paper, I'll know, oh, I'm missing something. It stands out because I color coordinated. There's other ways that you can do this too, like I mentioned with the cards and things like that. The second aspect is where I tend to make most of the changes. I go through and be like, I can't go this long without this, or I can't go this long without that. I need to get it in these 9 days. And then I go back and I look at the calendar and I see, does it fit in? Things like Sundays or holidays or meet days and things like that from the cycle before. And I make the best compromise that I can and go back and change it a couple times. As you saw on the one from last year, I changed the recovery run into needing to make it into a tempo run. There was a JV meet on one of those days, so it was just kind of like what I needed to get that in, because I couldn't go that long in that case without a tempo run. No cycle is going to be perfect. You're going to want it to be perfect, but you're going to drive yourself crazy with it. Know your why and compromise where you must. Not just where you can, not just because, where you have to. You've got too many meets, too many things, and not enough days. If you know your why, you know what is the most important thing that you're trying to get done in this point with your team, where you are in the season, knowing your why, and use that to make the compromises where you absolutely must, okay? This may mean some early season meets or unimportant meets become more training days for things like tempo runs, okay? But be careful to make sure that they stay as tempo runs if that is your why for the day. So again, so many times you hear a coach or whatever, or the athlete say, all right, we're just tempo running this meet, and they end up running, you know, one of their better times, you know, maybe they're 20 seconds, 30 seconds off their PR or what they ran the week before. It's like, that's not a tempo run then. That's something more like a critical velocity or some other workout type. Make sure you're being careful to make sure that they stay in tempo runs if you're doing that. And that's the easiest way to do it. You can't obviously make it into any, I mean, you probably wouldn't show up at a meet and make it into a recovery run or something like that unless for some reason you just needed to for number of meets or something like that. What I personally do, because this is what I'll end up doing a couple times a season, is by doing something like a VO2 max aerobic power the day before. So they have to tempo. They can't do anything really faster than that, but it can be done. It can also be done by doing Special Endurance 1 or Special Endurance 2 the day before a meet if you're trying to get these things in and you don't want to compromise and lose out on one of these training days, and you'd rather compromise on the meets. Later on in the season, you don't want to compromise on the meets because those are the important meets you've been getting ready for, but a couple couple of the workouts as we get later on, and I do some videos on pre-comp and the competitive phase, some of the workouts that we've been doing will start to become less important. Things like fly 30s, you can start to do fewer of them. Same thing with tempo runs, those important workouts that we've been doing for a long time. You can start to de-emphasize them and eventually eliminate them entirely, and you're only going to be doing things like those long hills for so long too. So by the end of the season, it starts to become a little bit easier. Specific prep is where that traffic jam can sometimes happen because you still have so many things to get done. So we'll get to those points with some other videos as we get into first doing long hills, because that transitions you from specific prep to pre-comp. And then we'll start looking at some pre-comp workouts, and we'll go and fill in the rest of the microcycles also here throughout our fictitious plan. I also plan on doing a video that talks about specific foot strength with barefoot runs on things like your extensive tempo and special endurance 2 intensive tempo days. I've mentioned those in a couple of videos, so that'll be the next one that I'll be working on here in the next day or two. If you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing or sharing it around. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments down below, and I'll link those videos I mentioned also in the description down below. And until next time, this has been Coachy TV.